Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let us begin the first, second actually session of this conference with Al-Kitab Al-Fatiha. Okay, praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most merciful and the most benevolent, and peace and blessings be to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his family, and his companions. Okay, welcome to all of you to the session on social conflict and religious extremism. Okay, in this auspicious gathering of scholars and also participants, the public, the educated public, students, lecturers, academics, I believe, are here, okay, to listen to deliberations by three prominent scholars who have done their own studies in fields of expertise connected with the general area of social conflict and religious extremism. Okay, we'll have all three presentations first, okay, and then we'll have the question and answer session at the end, okay, of all three presentations. So each presenter will be given about 20 minutes. We hope they don't exceed them, okay, so that we'll have ample time for Q&A. And I think this issue of social and religious extremism, okay, and also political extremism, okay, has been invoked recently, okay, even in this country, with many issues, okay, on the Muslim-only laundrette, okay, on proclamations by sultans, okay, heads of states, okay, on the banning of certain preachers who are considered to be extreme, okay, and then accusations and counter-accusations between preachers of different, okay, religious orientations. You are extremist, I'm not. Who's extremist? Okay, or who is considered an extremist? So these are all issues which are unresolved. And we'll listen to three, okay, very informative sessions, okay, or talks or seminars, okay, or discussions by our panelists today. The first is Prof. Bruce Lawrence, okay, who's a very prominent academic from United States of America. Okay, he's been a professor since I was still a baby, so that shows how the gap of years of experience that he has. And I think one of his most famous books or writings, Defenders of God, the Fundamentalist Revolt Against the Modern Age, okay, one which I encountered and read when I was doing my doctoral studies 20 years ago. So we'll have Prof. Bruce Lawrence first, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be back in Malaysia. This is not my first trip. I've been here before, and on my way from the airport, I just came this morning from Boston, where I gave a paper on Saturday. I think this is probably the... is that a clap for Boston or for me? I will take it as a clap for both. But I wanted to say that I had to give a paper in Boston, and so this is probably the first time in my life that I've given a paper on Saturday in the US and on Monday in Southeast Asia. And I'm glad I'm doing it here in Indonesia, and glad of this setting. I'm glad I'm doing it here in Malaysia. God, I forgot which country I'm in. I was thinking Indonesia because SBY is going to be talking, the former president of Indonesia, and I was actually teaching at UINJKT, the university in Jakarta, back in 2006 when he was president. So I'm looking forward to seeing him again. And I want to assure you, even though I'm talking about fundamentalism, that my real heart, my important work from at least over a decade now has been not on fundamentalism per se, but the Quran. And actually, I've just published a book where Malaysia comes up quite often called The Quran in English. And I just wanted to show you all that there is another book besides a fundamentalism book I've written called The Quran in English, which one reviewer said helps understand a book which is probably the most important and least understood book in the world today, and that is the Holy Quran. So I'm pleased to be here, even though my topic is not Quranic truths, but fundamentalism, and maybe I can relate the two. Let me say that fundamentalism is not a unique phenomenon. It is multifocal because the modernist regime or modernist hegemony was not limited to Christianity. It also affected Jews, and it also affected the lives and destinies of many Muslims. So the modern period and modernist rule didn't end with World War II or with the arrival of newly independent states. In fact, I would say one of the things that's most tragic about modernism is its silence. It appears in many places, but it's not well understood. If we examine the reduced public role of all three major Abrahamic religions, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, we see that fundamentalism emerges within each, but it emerges because it's expanded by the peculiar Western outlook that they all hold in common. In other words, my argument in that book and my argument about fundamentalism is even when it's Jewish or Muslim and not specifically Christian, that it's influenced by the forces of modernism, which itself comes out of a post-Christian culture. The second thing I want to stress is that fundamentalism is not per se a causal force, and it's not an epiphenomenon that is something that appears on the surface of underlying forces that are demographic or economic or political. Instead, and the one thing I want to emphasize in my brief talk this afternoon is that fundamentalism is above all not a religion, but an ideology. Fundamentalism is a novel ideology that matches the interests of specific groups responding to social tensions, the theme of this conference, and these tensions have been generated by the modern world. And the reason I say fundamentalism is an ideology is because it's also a religious ideology, since the beliefs of those who are fundamentalists, their practices, their challenges, their hopes and aspirations, all are framed in discourse that authorizes action through scriptural, creedal, and moral reference. So, what you would like to know from me probably is how do we cope with this threat, the modernist threat to religion, but also the fundamentalist response to that threat. And I want to share with you briefly something I've written a lot about, not only in my book, Defenders of God, which was mentioned in the introduction, but also in several subsequent essays, conferences, and further books, including my book on Shattering the Myth, Islam Beyond Violence. What I talk about in all these various places is the shift that occurred in the 18th, 19th centuries to references of what is important in the public sphere or what is important in the modern world. And I want to give you two quotations that come from very important people who are viewed as exponents of Western thought and above all enlightenment. And they cover the fields of natural sciences, history, law, politics, art, not simply metaphysics and theology, but all the sciences, both social and natural. And what happened in all these sciences, and I know you experience this in Malaysia as we have in Europe and the United States, is that most people, even when they are themselves devout, in their work no longer look to the concept of God, or Allah Ta'ala in Arabic. They no longer look to God or Allah Ta'ala for their justification or legitimacy. Instead, the various sciences see themselves as determining the concept on the basis of specific form. So the relations between the concept of God and the concepts of truth, morality, and law are not abandoned, but the index changes. What I call the exchange of index symbols takes place. So instead of having God or truth in the major place, you have authority and meaning. And this is called the exchange of index symbols. And it's very important. And let me just give you one example of how this works. I quote the father of empiricism, J. Stuart Mill, who himself said that men have been led to ask, in regard to some opinion, is it true? But then we were asked, what is the meaning of it? In other words, people used to ask, is it true? And now, since the 18th and 19th century in Western human sciences, the distinction becomes not what is true, but what is the meaning of. And this, it seems to me, is a very important way of remembering the shift in categories. So in talking about fundamentalism and fundamentalist language, we have to depend on ideology because it reflects the modernist mindset, not what is true, but what does it mean? And while most political ideologues, people who are concerned only with politics, would rather emphasize meaning over truth, a religious ideologue conjoins truth with meaning. And that, for me, is why fundamentalism is so important, so pervasive, and so little understood. The only way we can understand fundamentalism is, first of all, as a religious ideology. And this is why it's important. When I was younger, before I ever came to Malaysia back in 1996, or before I taught in Indonesia in 2006, I was part of something at the University of Chicago called the Fundamentalism Project. The Fundamentalism Project went from 1987 to 1995. It produced 5 volumes of essays, all based on a single principle. And the single principle is that there are family resemblances between religious actors, just as there are between different groups in politics or different elements in biology and science. And these family resemblances separate those who are fundamentalists from modernists, but also from other people who are believers, Christian, Jewish, and of course Muslim, but not fundamentalist. So let me end my talk by telling you what I think are the 5 characteristics of what creates fundamentalists and why it's so important to recognize this when we think about social change and social conflict. The first and most important is that fundamentalists, whatever or whoever, wherever they come, always advocate a minority view against a majority. Even when they are the majority, they claim to be a minority. They claim to be, in Protestant terms, the righteous vanguard, or those who alone are performing jihad on behalf of the world as a whole, as it happened in Iran after 1979 and later in Al-Qaeda. Secondly, fundamentalists are not only a minority, they are oppositional. They not merely disagree with their enemies, they confront them. And fundamentalists confront, above all, secular people who exercise political or juridical or military power. Third, and this is something often not remembered, is that most fundamentalists are male. It's not to say there aren't women fundamentalists, but the leaders tend to be male, and they tend to be males who have achieved some level of authority, but not the highest authority. And they claim for themselves authority from an unmediated appeal to Scripture, whether it's the Torah or the Injil, the Gospel, or the Quran in Islam. But because they eschew traditional leadership, these charismatic leaders believe that they can interpret Scripture on their own. Whether they're talking about a just order in Iran, or some kind of halakhic polity in Israel, or has happened in America, and unfortunately is happening again, the notion that there is a Christian and also a white Christian civilization that is under threat. But in every instance, what seems to somebody outside to be arbitrary is really for the fundamentalists the restoration of a mandate that is mediated by them through male and mostly and exclusively male interpreters. The fourth item that distinguishes fundamentalists from others is use of technical vocabulary. It's my opinion, and not mine only, George Steiner has said this, that language can be diffused in many ways. I just mentioned the word jihad. You all know what that means, but I think if I went around the room and we all said, let's write a message to each other of what we mean by jihad, even in this room where the phrase and the word is well known, there'll be different interpretations. So in the same way, the word halakha, which means the whole notion of tradition for Jews is interpreted differently. Creation does not mean the same thing for all Christians. For fundamentalists, creation means God created the world in 6 days, and if you don't believe that he rested on the seventh day, you're not one of us. The fifth thing about fundamentalists, beyond what I've just described, is that they have historical antecedents, but they themselves are original. Fundamentalism as a religious ideology is very recent. People say, oh, no, there was fundamentalism back in the days of the Reformation, or there was time back in the pre-Christian Judaism when the Maccabean revolt occurred, or the Wahhabi revolt, which many of you know within Sunni Muslim experience, that was fundamentalism. And of course, some people even think that Shiites were fundamentalists from the time that they viewed the martyrdom of Hussein in Karbala as their peak moment. But I argue, and I'd be willing to defend this if some of you question me about it, that fundamentalism is recent. It did not emerge until the end of the last century. It emerged in America and emerged within Protestant circles. It only became apparent in Judaism during the past 50 years, and that was a delayed reaction to the foundation of the State of Israel as a secular rather than a religious state. And then I would argue it only came up in majority Muslim countries after World War II, but especially after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So let me end by saying, and I promised the convener that I wouldn't be more than 18 minutes, and I think I'm now at 16. So let me finish with this, that the last trait, this business about fundamentalism as a part of protest movements, is especially important because it's not limited just to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. As we've seen in the 21st century, there are other instances of religious extremism that border on fundamentalism in Buddhism and Hinduism. When we think of what has happened in very recent years with the emergence of the Hindu right and Hindutva movement in India, and then most recently the tragedy in Myanmar, where it's actually Buddhist monks attacking Muslims in the name of their Buddhist privilege. All these, I think, are elements of a fundamentalist revolt against the nation state in the interest of privileging religion over any other rules of public conduct or political order. So I would like to leave you with the idea that fundamentalists are religious rebels, but they have social markings, they have historical antecedents, without which their religious loyalties cannot be understood, nor can they be countered with the peaceful expressions of religious dissent and social change that all of us would welcome. Thank you. And it's nice to be back in Malaysia.
Okay, thanks, Bruce, Professor Lawrence, okay, and brilliant time management as well. Okay, and I think for those of you who have this book in hand, okay, just please also look at page 12 for the panel abstract, okay, just to get a general idea on what we are talking about. And also the short bios, okay, the short biodatas of the speakers on page 41. Okay, and I think it was a good presentation by Bruce that he enlightened us on fundamentalisms from not just the Islamic perspective, but also from the Jewish perspective and also from the perspective of Christianity. Yeah, unfortunately, in this country, in Malaysia, we lack experts on comparative religion, okay, and especially even in institutions which teach Islamic studies, okay, we also lack a comparative religion exponent. Okay, so if we, if Muslims, okay, get angry at the West for essentializing Islam, not everyone is extremist and so on. There are several layers, several understandings of Islam. So if we lack knowledge of comparative religion, we also end up essentializing the West. The same thing. We see that the West is monolithic, or one phenomenon, and there's secular extremism over there, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and our next speaker, Professor Datuk Murad Merican, a retired professor from University of Technology Petronas, and he's now employed by University Science Malaysia, okay, where I'm also at, Center for Policy of Research and International Studies. He is a contract professor He's well known for his writings in New Straits Times on educational matters, and recently he's been actively organizing talks on Penang Malay-Muslim identity. Okay, I think we need no further introduction. Please refer to the short bio, okay, in this conference booklet, and please, okay, Prof. Datuk Murad.
Thank you, Professor Fauzi, my colleague at University of Science Malaysia. One correction, a professor never retires. A professor will work and would indulge in inquiry for as long as he's able to. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. This is the second time I'm invited to give a talk at this conference. The first one was last year. Last year, I was asked to deliberate on the education and higher knowledge, why people go to the university, the problems of university education, the problems of higher education now in Malaysia and other parts of the world, the problems of modern education. I'll come back to that at the end of my deliberation, but I'll move to the topic, which is social conflict and religious extremism. First of all, I think when we talk about extremism, we automatically would conjure things Islam and Islamic. That extremism is always associated with Islam, with Muslim societies, with what Muslims do. Here, I think we need to look into the fundamental meaning of extremism. I will be using extremism, fundamentalism, and terrorism interchangeably, but most of the time I'll be focusing on the term extremism. Essentially, it means the middle way. It means the middle path. It means not deviating to your right or to your left. It is not the same as moderation. It is not being moderate, because the connotation, the present connotation of being moderate and so-called moderate Islam is different from the middle way. It's different from how we practice our belief, our thinking, our religion, our theology, fundamentally as such. No bid'ah, no deviating, no excesses, and so on. I'm not a student of extremism. I dabble into ideas, and perhaps I think that's why I'm here. I dabble into ideas on history, although I'm not a historian, on the historiography, on the writing of history, on interpretation, on ideas about human society, and so on. So I look at extremism as an idea, and a more important idea in modern times. So extremism is, to set it correct, is the middle path. I would not link it to the term or the semantics of moderation or being moderate. For example, in here, Malaysia, over the last few years, one newspaper has promoted the sentiment and the ideology of moderation, a call for a moderate Malaysia. And if you look at the figures that they have used to talk about moderation in Malaysia, they would not include people who pakai ketayap or people who go to religious schools. Even the Muslims that they have portrayed, they're Muslims, but they conjure an image of being liberal Muslims. Nothing wrong with being liberal. Again, I think these are terms that we need to come to terms with. So in other terms, the Western conception of being moderate is that Muslims who drink and don't pray, that's moderate Muslim. If Muslims who pray and follow the obligations, they become extremists and fundamental. So that is the mainstream Western connotation of Islam, which has been brought forward by one of our newspapers who have manifested that idea or the image of moderate Islam. I know that they may not link to those Muslims being deviant as such, but they would certainly exclude, for example, the Imam and the Ulama, which they have. Okay? And here they're giving the image that Imams and Ulama are not moderate. So again, we have to be careful in terms of how we engage ourselves with the language of moderation and moderate and the construct of a moderate Malaysia. So this is one aspect I think that we have to be literate and to be aware of. Now, extremisms have happened throughout history. The sage, Jalaluddin Rumi, you read his Masnavi, one of his, he has a voluminous, 6-volume, millions of couplets. But there's one thing that he said, what we see change who we are. Why we're discussing about extremism and religious extremism is not because it is a new phenomenon. It has happened over the last 2,000 years. It becomes a phenomenon now because of certain factors. One of which is because of technology and the media. It amplifies things. What happened all over the world, we are engaged in, we see what happened. Visuals are put across our social media, television, radio, the internet. So because of that visuality, okay, and that orality, okay, we are engaged in, and it becomes a subject of interest to us. But again, when we talk about extremism, it is not only Islam. Okay, I'm not saying that only the religion of Islam is extremist. And I'm not saying that necessarily Islam is extremist. Throughout history, there are other religions and there are also secular extremisms. There are secular ideologies that has committed extremist acts and have extremist tendencies. If we go throughout history, for example, the moving of the religion of Christianity, the religion of Nabi Isa, from Jerusalem to Rome itself is an act of extremism. There were schisms at that time that led to the movement of the religion of Christianity to Rome, hence it becomes Roman Catholic. And as we move along, in modern history, especially in European history, we'll find that the collapse of the Catholic Church in the 1500s and the rise of Protestantism, the activities of Martin Luther himself, can be seen to be extremist in that climate and in that nature, because he was putting the posters at Wittenberg and undermining the theology and the belief of the Christian church. So also with the conflict between science and religion in Europe, 1700. So you see, these are extremists in nature. But also I would like to point out that a little bit earlier, in the 1300s, we find that acts of an act that attempted or that has divided the world into two. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1398, between Catalan and Portugal. Catalan is now they're trying to move away from Spain. So it was Catalan and Portugal who signed a treaty to divide the world into two. The Western Hemisphere is to be given to Portugal. The Eastern Hemisphere is to be given to Spain. And that evolved various extremist acts that began the process of colonialism And here I'm putting that colonialism is backed by a religiosity. Because when the West moved out of Europe to colonize the whole world, at the back of their minds was the cross. And one of the motto was St. Paul's motto, Mata Moro, kill the Muslims. Mata Moro, kill the Muslims. And to us in Malaysia, we look at colonialism as a benign process. But if you ask people outside of Malaysia, because we were not killed by the British, but the colonialists, British, French, Italians, for example, in Addis Ababa, in Italy, there's a monument in memory of 4,000 Ethiopians killed in the 1930s. But at the same time, in Italy, they created a monument to celebrate the person who massacred the Ethiopians in Italy. So again, colonialism is a process of, is a violent process. It is an extreme process. If you look at the colonial powers, the first thing that they did, one of the first thing was, okay, they came with that religion in mind. Subsequently, they came and they asked for land. Asking for land, okay, somebody coming from another part of the world and asking for land from outside of their cultural sphere is something which is not normal. It deviates from the norm. It deviates from the middle path. Why would you ask for land? Failure in which they will grab and steal the land. This is what happened in Penang when the British stole the island from the Sultan of Kedah. Why I'm saying this? Because I'm doing a study on this. I'm looking at old documents to rebut that there was a treaty between Francis Light and the Sultan of Kedah. So they came to this part of the world. They went to Africa. They went to India. They exterminated. They claimed it is their land. And what happened after that? The ethnicity of the local people and the identity of the local people are erased. So this erasure of identities and ethnicities is an extremist act. It is an act of extremism. In other words, we are robbed of our originality. We are robbed of who we call we are. We are given another identity. There's one book titled Colonial Knowledge, when the author Bernard Cohen says that when the whites came to this part of the world, what they did was to empty our brains, short of cutting our head off. And they fill up our brains, they empty our brains with so-called indigenous knowledge that we have, and they fill up our brains with colonial knowledge. If you ask Maoris in New Zealand, they will say how extreme the English have treated them. They treated non-whites, they treated people of non-European descent as subhumans. Is that not extreme? I think that the world must also see the other side of colonialism instead of constructing extremism as a Muslim phenomenon. So that is secular. Apart from colonialism, you also have secular ideologies like fascism and Nazism. Those are extreme secular ideologies. And also, I'm going to mention this on the extreme state. Extreme state, nation state. In the proximities of our geopolitical position, I would label two states as extreme. Country Surin is not here. Huh? One is Burma, the other is Thailand. Why Burma? We know Burma, the Rohingyas are being exterminated, not physically, not so much, okay, physically is one thing, but they cannot even call themselves Rohingya. They cannot even, the people cannot even give a name to themselves, cannot give an ethnicity and identity to themselves. So what do you call this? It's not terrorism, it's more than terrorism. Same with Thailand. You may hear bombings here and there. but there is a subtle way of exterminating the ethnicity and identity of the Patanis in Thailand. I had just had a workshop with them 3 weeks ago in USM. They came and they asked us to conduct a workshop on what they can do. I was a bit naughty. I know that the Thai government would not like whatever suggestions, but I suggested to them certain things that they can do, because what they told me was that they can't even teach history in their schools. There are cases where ulamas who taught history, Patani history, they were killed. There are cases in which those who pronounce referendum, public opinion, they were shot. And of course, most of them may not be able to speak Malay well. Again, there is extermination of their language and culture. So I was telling them, and they asked me a question. Is it all right if they were to take up arms against the Thai government? Everybody was silent in the room. But I said, in the context of the UN and self-determination, a suppressed group can take up arms. But when we see people taking up arms, we will label them as terrorists. But again, there is a difference between extremists and terrorists. A terrorist need not be an extremist.
One more minute, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, extremism of the moderator.
One more? Okay. A terrorist need not be an extremist. A terrorist would be people who may want to determine their future and develop a state. So there are many cases in which extremists are labeled as terrorists. And my last point, just I want to note, perhaps it can be continued later, is that the consciousness of Islam as a terrorist religion and an extremist and fundamentalist religion came about in the modern period in 1978-79 with the Iranian Revolution. That had actually redefined news about Islam. It redefined news until now. There are 4 stages of redefinition of news. The first stage was in 1979, second was 9/11, third was when ISIS emerged about 4 years back, and fourth, Trump's order banning Muslims from 4 countries. Thank you so much.
Okay, shukran, thank you, Datuk Prof. Murad. And I think he has touched upon a very important aspect of extremism, which we often neglect, that is educational extremism. And I think one of the foremost concerns of Datuk Murad is on decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing history, and he has organized this Siri Syarahan Datuk Janatun in Penang, in St. Pris, USM, Penang, to decolonize the history of Penang, which has been too much anglicized. Okay, as if the history of Penang started with Francis Light, whereas there were other Malay explorers, okay, such as Datuk Janatun. And I'm also saying this because I see Tan Sri Razali, who's a descendant, okay, I think of Datuk Janatun, one of the first Malay explorers who opened up Penang. Okay, so this is Datuk Murad's one of his foremost concerns now. Okay, the next speaker, an old-time friend of mine, Prof. Muhammad Kamarulnizam Abdullah, formerly of UKM, and then he moved to University Utara, Malaysia, okay, as the Dean of School of International Studies now. Okay, and he's got a string of degrees from universities of Utah, ANU, and then Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Okay, and I think he's very much a peer of mine. I remember he came to visit me when we were in the UK, and he actually interviewed me for his PhD. Maybe at that time he thought I was an extremist. So if you look, he has a book published by UKM, Politics of Islam in Contemporary Malaysia, and I was one of the informants. Okay, and we've also been paired recently in several vivas, okay, at UM, at UUM, at USM, okay, and also at IIUM, okay, and we've failed some and passed some. So for those postgraduates here who are doing research on Islam and politics, just watch out for us because we might end up becoming your fierce examiners. Okay, so without further ado, can I invite Prof. Kamarulnizam, okay, to say what he wants to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Fauzi, my old friends, my fellow panelists, Professor Bruce, whom I read a lot his thought in various sources, books, journals, Datuk Murad, Tan Sri Nordin, Vice Chancellor of USAS, Tan Sri Razali, also I think a young professor now in UUM. No more? No more. This is a kind of nostalgic in terms of this is the first time I'm standing here in Perak, you know, after 25 years in the academia. Although I'm a Perakian, but this is my first time in Perak, delivering a kind of a very interesting topic, which I have been doing research on this since my master's program at Australian University, then after that in Lancaster. I'm talking about managing the threat of religious terrorism. My presentation will be divided into three parts. One, more on the background or the conceptual of it. Secondly, looking at what are the questions in terms of what are the contributing factors to understand the problems that we have now. Although it's not new. Extremism, fundamentalism is nothing new in the world, and even in Malaysia. We have faced these kind of problems since independence, even before the independence. And thirdly, I would like to trying to find a solution or some kind of suggestions, what and where we can move. Conceptually, when we're talking about extremism, we are talking about, in Malaysia, we're talking about deviant teaching and all that, something that, you know, a development whereby that organizations or movements, you know, try to reinterpret Islam the way they wanted it to interpret it. Then after that, we come with the word fundamentalism, but I'm not comfortable with the word fundamentalism because we are borrowing the Christianity kind of debate on fundamentalism. When we're talking about fundamentalism, I am fundamental because I'm going back. My everyday life is about the fundamental understanding of Islam, you know, praying 5 times a day, you know, fasting and all that. That's a fundamental tenet of Islam. So people, some scholars, you know, do not like the word, especially Muslim scholars, do not like the word fundamentalism. Then we have a political religious extremisms. This is where that, you know, some so-called religious movements, Muslim movements, try to politicize Islam to suit to their interests. And lately we have the concept of religious terrorism. This is what Jamaah Islamiyah had brought, and this is how Daesh, or we also known about ISIS, you know, are doing. So basically, when we're talking about deviant, fundamentalism, political, religious extremism, or religious terrorism, you know, unfortunately, we are talking about something that associated with Islam, although the history of extremism does not necessarily related to Islam. Okay, it happened in Christian community, it happened in Hinduism and all that. But unfortunately, since the globalized era, it's always been associated with Islam. What's wrong is that we are dealing with the minority. This is what Professor Surin highlighted just now. But they are both powerful movements that try to paint out that at least religions condone what they are doing. At least Muslim or even Islam supported their struggle. But the problem is that, are they right? The puzzle is that why religious motivated terror attacks that you have witnessed in Madrid, in London, in all over the world, has become a norm rather than exception. So, secondly, what are alternatives, approach and strategy, how to deal with them, and how to manage these evolving threats? Let me offer you some possible contributing factors on religious terrorism that we are facing now. One is a mirrored and contextual. We have to understand it from the contextual understanding. In 1960s, in 1960s and 1970s, when you're talking about terrorism, we always associate it with a nationalist movement. Even when you're talking about people, Palestinian Liberation Army, it was basically a Wasataniyah movement, rather than a kind of religious kind of movement. But PLO during that time managed to ignite the religious sentiment because of the Baitul Muqaddis issue. But basically, this is a kind of nationalist movement. But throughout the years, when you're looking at extremism, fundamentalism, or religious terrorism, it is a kind of an interesting development whereby that, religion become a kind of dominant factor in the struggle. The factor that can amass a lot of supports from Muslims all over the world. Even though we know that the movement itself is not really represent Islam. Talking about Abu Sayyaf, for examples, they are kind of saying themselves as a liberator, using Islam as a kind of their political motive. But basically, they are not really represents Islam. Globalization basically, in terms of information technology and communications, contribute a lot in terms of the way they expose themselves, the way they communicate with all the targeted people, the struggle and all that. And that's why religious terrorism that associated with Islam, become a dominant mainstreams in today's world. Thirdly, when you turn to understand about extremism, religious terrorism, the role of charismatic leader is very, very important. The leader itself become the paramount influential factor, in garnering support from the people. I think Professor Ahmad Fauzi can talk about the role of charismatic leaders. And you can see how Daesh, with a kind of minimal background in religious studies, but basically can garner support from all Muslim people all over the world. Another phenomena that understanding extremism, religious terrorism is that nowadays especially is about basically most of us that involved in this kind of movement, they have a lot of Islamic knowledge. They talk about jihad, they talk about struggle, but never understand what jihad really means. And this is a problematic. And this is the kind of my criticism in terms of our education system, which I think I can associate with in terms of making a kind of a proposal. I agree with Professor Surin that in today's Muslim world, we always talk about, I'm right, you're wrong. And I'm always right. I have more knowledge than you. But basically this won't help basically the Muslim community. Because our education system, religious education system, always emphasize on haram and haram. Never talk about tolerance. How to deal with the non-Muslim. We always label the non-Muslim as kafir and kafir and kafir. Haram and halal. And we always talk about tolerance, moderations. But the way we teach our generations is always based on do and don'ts. So I think the teaching pedagogy must be changed. We can have a kind of a religious education, either offered officially by the national education system or by the religious education system. But basically I want to suggest that we should have a subject on religious tolerance whenever we are teaching our generation on Fardu Ain. Because this is very important for them to accommodate with the most globalized and challenging world, whereby now we are not dealing only with our community, we are dealing with other community, non-Muslim community. This leads to my second, factors that contributing to this kind of problem is that this is a kind of very puzzling and very worrying development, whereby that younger generation becoming more and more involved in extremism, especially on religious terrorism. Maybe one of the contributing factors to understand that, these generations, they want a quick change. They're very impatient. They're looking of injustice, political discriminations. They wanted a kind of quick solution to that. I know that even my students, when they make some kind of a suggestion, the way they put it, their argument is that everything is wrong. We need a kind of quick fixation on all these problems, whereby they don't understand. We are living in a complex world. There is no single or shortcut answer to phenomena that all the problems that we face with. And being a kind of younger generation, they are very impatient. And they are emotionally manipulated. And this explains basically why, a lot of younger generations, involved in Daesh and also in ISIS. Because they can be easily swayed with this kind of issue. But at the same time, we have a kind of a generation with a low esteem, meaning that they don't have friend, loner, lone ranger, and they will try to seek some answers to their problems. And this is also a kind of problems, that explain why they easily being influenced in the extremist or religious terrorism. Some coming from broken family and marriage. And this is the problem that I think we should look back at our society. As we become more modernized, the family values now become being neglected. We have been exposed to gadget. During dinner time, even during a family dinner time, we hardly talk to each other. Everybody, is busy with our WhatsApp, with our Facebook and all that. There's no communication among the family members. And this is a kind of social problems that we need to understand. We need to look back. We have to reflect why the society become like that, why there are minorities, some fraction of our society become an extremist. Another issue about this younger generation involvement is what I call it narcissism. Narcissism is a kind of self-centered, excessive interest in oneself. Younger generation tend to show off what they have. Okay, they want to show something. They want to prove something. That I'm brave enough. I can join whatever I want to join. Then this is a problem basically. Narcissism can contribute to the involvement of some activities, either at the right side or the wrong side, meaning the far right You know, you might be involved in some problems, teenagers problem, or at the left side, the far right problem is that you might involve in kind of religious terrorisms. But these problems also, you know, compounded by the fact that, you know, the development of extremism, conservatisms of a younger generation can also contribute to the issues of racism. That you always think yourself as a right people, right to interpret what you want, but basically you try to belittle others' ability or others' belief. And this is a kind of a worrying development when I see at our society. In Islam, our relation to God and our relation to society, you know that hablum minallah and hablum minan nas. Is no problem is to become more conservative, more fundamental when you're talking about relation in terms of hablul minallah. But when you're talking about hablul minan nas, your relation with society and other people, you must be more accommodative, tolerance toward the others, because we are different. We must adaptive to others' differences. And this is the problems in the society, whereby you know, we cannot accept differences, and we also see ourselves as the right one, and the others are the wrong one. And this is also explain the phenomena of Daesh. For example, that first, they are talking about Islamic utopianism, you know, based on caliphate system. So whatever system that they have now is a wrong system. Okay? So what they wanted is about Islamic Caliphate system. They propagate the Salafi Jihadi as if that, you know, other interpretations are wrong. And they're highly motivated and willing to defend their struggle by using selected verses of Quran. Okay? This is a problem. You know, you justify your action when you select only what suits to your struggles. So what we had done so far, we tried to neutralize the threats. How many minutes? 1 minute. I think by using force, but using force is not the right solution. It's not a long-term solution. It's a kind of a short-term solutions. What I'm proposing is about transformational approach. You know, that we are doing, even Professor Ahmad Fauzi is doing, is that first, like I just mentioned earlier, that we had to look back, reflect at the way that we look at our religion, the teaching of religion, whether this is a correct way, you know, the way we teach our generation, our children's, in terms of have and have not. Either it is appropriate just to talk about halal and haram, whereby that we become more intolerant with the others. When we're talking about rehabilitations, you know, for example, that we involve in the rehabilitation process of the militants. You know, law enforcement is just law enforcement. It's nothing more than that. You know, you put somebody in jail, the militant is jail, but how to rehabilitate them? Especially those who don't understand Islam very much. And that's what rehabilitation is always talking about, dialogue. Even among the militants and also among the rehabilitators, we're always talking about dialogue. We never impose our own values to the others. We listen. Let them, you know, some kind of have self-consciousness what they have done. That they themselves wanted to correct rather than they impose on that. In this kind of generation or in this kind of the world, we cannot impose our values. But dialogue can help. And this is, I think, the way forward that when we look at the problem of religious terrorism, extremisms. That for me, we cannot talking about the use of force. But we have to reflect into our society what wrong with our society, but at the same time, we have to become more tolerant to the differences. I think on that note, Mr. Chairman, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Kamarulnizam, for the very enlightening talk. And I think he's also involved with research on Malaysian responses to Daesh, to Islamic State in Malaysia. And he's also one of the main academics being referred to by the counter-terrorism force in Bukit Aman for academic input. Okay, and he also mentioned about the importance of educational conditioning, and especially how we teach Islam, how we teach religion. Can I also add on that note that not only is that important for the Asatizah community, the Islamic studies specialists, but perhaps it is more important for the non-Asatizah community. There's a book published last year by Princeton University Press. It's called Engineers of Jihad. Actually, I brought that book, and I'll be picking up some points from that book tomorrow when I speak as a panelist in the first panel. And it discloses information that if you look, if you survey actually who these extremists are, not just Islamic, but even Christian right-wing, they are overrepresented by engineers, not religious studies experts. Okay, and it's been put in a book which you can read, and all the evidence is there. Okay, I will speak later, about this tomorrow. But now we have around a good 15 to 20 minutes for our question and answer session, and I invite questions from the participants. Please come to any of the mics, at the middle or even in the front here if you want to. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, your organization perhaps, and please choose any of the panelists you want to direct to, or even if you want to ask a general question, directed to all the panelists, and we'll have the opportunity to hear from our panelists. So please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Yes.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
I'm Muhammad Shafinas Ghazali. I would like to ask the panelists, both if possible.
Can be a bit clearer, please? A bit louder.
I would like to ask panelists about the term of extremist. From what I understand from Datuk Murad, the act of the British when they go to Australia, to New Zealand, it can be, if I'm not mistaken, it can be seen or termed as an act of extremism. And I believe it goes same to the British when they go to USA. And in 1920s, I believe, based on the term given by Datuk Murad, even the government of Saudi now, the Kingdom of Saudi, is also, when they took the power, took over the power, that can be construed as extremist action. Am I wrong on that? Thank you.
Okay, this to Datuk Murad. Yeah.
What's the question?
Can you
the acoustics is bad.
Can you repeat that, please? Request from the panelists.
Basically, from what I understand from Datuk Murad, the act of the colonialism, like New Zealand, Australia, or even US, that is the act of extremism. Can I conclude like that?
Or saying Bahasa Malaysia, if it's not clear. He still doesn't get the question.
I think we
Just speak
we are
so
the
that he
panelists.
understands.
We have a problem in listening to the speaker because I think that the echo sound is very big. Yeah.
Sebuah suara.
We cannot, catch what really you want to ask because of the problem with the speaker.
Test. Okay, from what I understand from Datuk Murad,
Okay, yeah.
okay, the act of colonialism from British to New Zealand, to Australia, or even to US, can be construed as act of extremism. That's what I understand.
Okay.
Am I wrong on that?
Yeah. Okay.
Or am I right? And then same goes to Kingdom of Saudi in 1920s when they took over the power. Can we say that is also the act of extremism? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, over recent years, there has been greater discourse on colonialism. Okay? And there are a number of disclosures on what has happened in the past. Essentially, we may see colonialism as a benign process of a power taking over or controlling a subjugated society. But if we look at the beginnings of colonialism in terms of the intentions of the Western European powers, their intention of dividing the world, and that the motto of St. Paul's motto, Mata Moro, which means kill the Muslims. In other words, they have, in a sense, deviated from the middle path. And much of colonial history, much of us do not know colonial history, and much of us do not know European history. It's important for us to know European history and colonial history so that we know the structure of colonialism. Now people are talking about decolonization. Before we go to decolonization, we have to know what colonialism means. If it means taking over land, if it means killing millions of people, the story of Columbus killing American Indians is famous. I think about 10 million were killed. If you know the story of how the Europeans went to Africa, the stereotype image of Africa, the stereotype image of the blacks. If you were to read Joseph Conrad's novel, on Africa and how the character treated Africans as subhumans. If you know the massacre in parts of Africa, and I mentioned Ethiopia, and also in India, how they looted India, how they, if you go to India, you find that the Europeans who went there in the 16th, 1700s, they will be envious that India was more developed and more civilized and having a high level of economic productivity than Europe. So again, what they've done is to decapacitate India. And the British whip Macaulay wrote a paper saying that they have to educate Indians in English because Persian and Hindi was not good enough to make a person civilized. So again, it's not only physical extermination, but it's also cultural extermination. I would say that it's genocide. Colonialism has created a genocidal situation. We don't feel it because we are alive. We are still alive now, and our generations are still alive. But it's actually cultural genocide. Of course, when it came to Malaya, it was okay. But they have taken out, decapacitated the indigenous political systems. They have displaced undang-undang kanun, undang-undang Islam in the Malay states. Is that not extremism? In a sense, that may not be terrorism, but that's extremism. Again, we have to divide extremism into two. One, violent extremism, the other, non-violent extremism. Non-violent extremism is where you go through, it involves thinking, theology, medicine, and other forms of knowledge. That's non-violent extremism. So again, when this is a discourse which is coming up, and there are a number of books that has criticize and disclose the negativity and the inhumane nature. And there's one article which I came across where the author used this term, humane colonialism. And I cited that in the manuscript, and now I'm thinking of taking it back and questioning, is there such thing as a humane colonialism? So again, if we look at the continuum of rationality, that's extreme.
Can I, let me just add one word to what Dr. Dr. Ahmad Merican said in a very straightforward way. One of the people whom I have studied and admired a lot is Merican Banabi. Merican Banabi is a scholar from Algeria who actually studied in France, and his French was better than many of his teachers. And of course, he also knew Arabic. But then when the revolution happened in Algeria, they didn't want a Muslim back. They wanted a secular government, so he had to live in Egypt. And it was from Egypt that he constructed his whole notion of epistemic violence. And this is, I think, a very important notion. The physical violence is real of colonialism, but what Merican Banabi talks about and repeatedly accents in his many writings is epistemic violence, which is not only all the murders and carnage and, as you said, the cultural displacement, but the displacement of a whole heritage. And so a colleague of mine, Walter Mignolo, wrote a book called The Darker Side of the Renaissance, where he explores all this. Even though he himself is Latin American, he says, this is how it's happened in Asia, this is how it's happened in Africa, and it is a global, not only a regional, but a global misfit. And it has to be corrected, but there has to be epistemic as well as material response to colonialism.
Yeah, I would like to mention, because I wanted to mention one point just now. It's on the Israel and the Palestinians. It's not Israeli occupying Palestine. It's the Israelis colonizing Palestine. It's not a problem. It's not only an issue of injustices and terrorizing. It's also taking away their knowledge. So where Palestine is concerned, when Edward Said wrote The Question of Palestine, he was not talking so much about the violence. He was talking about the violence in knowledge, where when you exterminate the people, you exterminate the roots of their epistemology. Similarly with parts of, we're talking about India and Malaysia. Our epistemology has been taken over by colonial knowledge, and it's still present now. And well, Malik Banabi is concerned, he's a very angry man, actually.
Yeah. He's very angry, but also very passionate.
Exactly.
Okay,
and he believed in jihad with a pen.
Yeah.
Not jihad with a sword, but jihad with a pen.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Lawrence and Prof. Merican. I think we have to move on to the second question, please.
Yeah, this is a question for Professor Bruce Lawrence. Maybe we'll talk about it a bit more.
Junaid, I'm not going to, anything that Khairuddin Junaid asked me, I'm not going to answer.
We will discuss about it more during dinner, but I have a question actually in regards to fundamentalism. You mentioned,
bit louder, please.
Yeah, I want to ask about fundamentalism. You mentioned about religious fundamentalism, but if you look at a lot of the problems that are currently faced by Muslims all over the world, we are in the face of what I would call as circular fundamentalism. And this is secular fundamentalism.
Secular
Fundamentalism, and this is a fundamentalism that you are talking about just now when you are discussing about Malik bin Nabi, and that in many countries all over the world, secular states have policies that are fueling a lot of radicalism, and we hear it this morning from Colonel Ann Wright. She was actually talking about the US. And how the US has fueled a lot of the problems, not only in the Muslim world, but basically she was saying the world over. So my question to you is, could we say that circular fundamentalism is actually one of the causes of the problems that we have today, not only in the Muslim world, but probably the world over? And what is the intellectual antidote or solution? What is the way out intellectually from all of these fundamentalisms that we are faced with right now?
It's a great question, and actually Thank you for asking. I was kidding when I said I wouldn't answer a question if you asked it. But I knew it would be a tough question. That's why I hesitated. But I mentioned, if you recall, towards the end of my talk, the Fundamentalism Project. It took place over 7 years. We had somebody who was a very famous professor from Harvard, Dewey Ming. He's an expert in Confucianism. And he came out and he said, I am here to announce that the original fundamentalism was Confucianism. Because we don't have to believe in a transcendent, we believe in a ruler, and the ruler controls, and he was Kung Fu Tzu, and so Confucianism is the original fundamentalism. Robert Bellah, the very famous social scientist who used to teach at Berkeley, Robert Bellah was present, and he said, I'm sorry, but Confucian fundamentalism has been superseded by secular fundamentalism. And then Robert Bellah, I'm sure you know who he is, Robert Bellah then went through all these things which I mentioned in my talk. He said when you shift from having any notion of truth that is religious, that can be affirmed by the majority of people, and you shift the index to meaning, which of course is what Gertz did, Clifford Gertz, but he followed Charles Peirce. I could give you the whole genealogy of Western theorists who said, no, we cannot agree on truth, so let's just figure out the meaning of things. That shift in index symbols from truth to meaning is itself the basis of secular fundamentalism. But it's used as a way to say, oh, it's what religious people do because they still cling to the truth. And the reason I feel very strongly when one talks about religious fundamentalism, one should say, first of all, it's an ideology because it has to be effective in the public space. But secular fundamentalism claims that it alone controls the public space. So I think the problem in whether it's religious or secular fundamentalism is creating dyads, what I call, or the popular term now, you've been at Georgetown, you've heard people use the word silo. So a silo means something that stands by itself and it doesn't see the silo that's next door to it. It'd be as if you're standing in Malaysia and you say there's not a country called, what is it named? Indonesia. Or there's not a place named Singapore. Or there's not the Philippines. Only Malaysia counts. That would be a silo view of Malaysia. And of course it'd be false. And nobody here would accept it. But secular fundamentalism and Trumpism, if I can use that phrase, Trumpism is the ultimate outcome of secular fundamentalism. When only the leader's thoughts counts, he can Twitter anything, and he stands as the absolute ruler, and it doesn't matter whether he invokes religion, or he invokes his company, or he invokes the world, he is viewed as the ultimate thing. So secular fundamentalism, by creating silos, allows for some disaster, and unfortunately in America it's now called Trump.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Lawrence, and also to Prof. Kamarulnizam from National University of Singapore who asked the question. I'm sorry that I have time for only one more question. Okay, and we're going to finish at 3:55 on the dot. So someone who has been waiting there, please, quick last question for this session, and for others who want to ask questions to the panelists, please, during your free time, okay, outside of the formal session.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Actually, this question open to anybody who on the stage that can answer this. How can a culture, a Malay culture, reduce the extremism in the world now? How can we apply our culture to reduce or perhaps to eliminate? Because I think in every culture in the world, they don't promote any extremism. So I think if we think about culture in a very humanity way, it will reduce any extremism. So I think if we can actually educate people about culture, it can help.
Okay, who are you directing this question to?
Anybody
Anybody
on the stage?
Anybody want to volunteer?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes, in eliminating extremism.
Well, you're asking, is culture an element in fundamentalism?
No. Actually, I'm asking about if can a culture, any race culture, can reduce extremism in any ideas, any world.
Well, I think if I understand the question is, how does culture relate to other categories? How do you use culture in thinking about extremism, or you think about public activity?
Okay, perhaps if I can relate with my culture, in Malay culture, there's no such thing as extremism in our culture because we are very soft. So how can, that's why I'm telling you that, how can we actually bring up the value in culture to eliminate extremism?
Well, I think other panelists have the answer, but my answer is that there's a very important book written actually by somebody who was born in Malaysia, although he wound up being educated in other foreign places like England and America. His name is Shahab Ahmad, and he wrote a book called What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic. And he argues that culture and religion and civilization all get confused when one thinks only about the past. But in the present, and he's very much somebody who's an historian, but he says in the present, and this goes back to the point that Datuk made very strongly, the media reduce everything to 2 or 3 categories. So the culture becomes something that's other than religion. And it's when you, again, the answer I gave to Khairuddin Junaid, is that when you think about everything as separate, that culture is somehow different than religion, that Islam is only religion or not culture, or every culture determines its own form of religion, then you're lost in a sea of relativism, because culture is always, it seems to me, integral to a society, and culture and religion are not opposites, but rather cousins.
Just one more minute.
You're saying how to use culture to overcome extremism?
Yeah, because in Malay we say that bersendikan syarak dan bersendikan kitabullah. Yang itu maksud saya di sini. Adat bersendikan syarak dan budaya bersendikan kitabullah macam itu. Maksudnya sekarang orang Melayu biasanya dia tidak memberontak ataupun dia very soft because they have a very different way of telling their anger and everything. They are not extremists. So perhaps if we can actually impose that ideas to all Malaysian, that with a culture we can actually eliminate extremism, because our culture is totally related to Islam. That's why, because they don't actually we are not extremists. That's why I'm trying to tell you.
But I mean, I thought
Short answer, please.
years ago, we always talk about, Islam is ad-din wa dunya. Islam not only religion but also a culture of the society, isn't it?
Yes.
But somehow or other, the current debate, for example, that put forward by so-called extremist movement, they try to detach culture as part of the religious understanding. The Salafi totally reject culture as part of Islam, and this is a problem. I mean, in Malaysia, we always look Islam as part of the culture, because we cannot understand Islam in Malaysia without understanding the culture of the society. And the way we practice Islam in Malaysia is basically, somehow or other we are different from what has been practiced in Indonesia, although the fundamental teaching of Islam is still there. And this is, I think, that we have, to propagate in the forefront, talking about, we cannot detach culture from religions, because they are comprehensive. Islam is not only about religions, but it's about culture, the society that embrace the religions. Thank you.
I think you have to see Islam intertwined with culture, because every society in this world has culture and also adopt Islam as a form of belief. There's one book by Syed Hussein Nas, it was mentioned just now. He has recognized that there are a number of the Muslim societies are all have culture unique to themselves, and it represents different forms of Islam. So again, you cannot see Islam in its abstract form. It is embedded, and when you talk about culture, we're talking about Malay South Asian culture. And again, the problem here is the Malays, orang Melayu, we don't know our culture. We don't know how we think. We are white men in the brown mask. Because we have been, it's not only the Malays, but the others as well. And again, over the last few years, we find that, especially after 1978, after the Iranian Revolution, Malay society has undergone evolution with regard to identity, with regard to economic wealth, and they colluded. Okay? And at some point, there are questions of whether you want to be a Malay or you want to be an Arab. So it's also the process of Arabization, unsettled over so many centuries, and the process of being indigenous. So again, we have to be settled at this. Yeah, you're right, culture is an important tool to resolve aspects of extremism, because in Malay culture, over the last, say, 500 years, you do not find terrorist activities. Okay? You do not find fundamentalist activities, you do not find extremist activities in the sense that we know now. So that's why we have to go back to how we understand the structure of Malay culture and the structure of Malay worldview. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all the presenters and also to all the participants, okay, for a very energetic question and answer session. And with that note, can we end this session with Surah Al-Asr? Bismillah.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to know I have somebody else who's a fan of Malik bin Nabi.
I let him.
Okay, on for the next session.
He's such a brilliant writer, but because he was francophone, most of the people